Aloha, and thank you for joining us for The Reality Show. We're going to get into the reality of what's going on in the headlines today, some of the stories and some of the ideas behind them. We've got a big topic right up front, but also the TUC. Now, those of you in the U.S. won't know what that is, the Trades Union Congress. This is the Union of Unions in the UK. Well, in the UK, they're calling for a quote-unquote modest wealth tax on the wealthy. That's right. It's not enough to tax people's income like we do in the US. They said some people are too rich. They're holding on to money. That money sitting under your mattress in the bank needs to be taxed. We're going to talk about that. A big trial balloon being raised in the UK. And also today is a happy birthday to the late, great T.E. Lawrence. That's right, Lawrence of Arabia. Wait a minute, he was a complicated guy. Villain? Hero? Let's talk about that. But our main topic for the day, to start off, WeWork. We brought up WeWork before, shared office spaces. This great company rose up quickly, reached a $47 billion valuation. And they're now worth $450 million. Yes, they're on the verge of bankruptcy. Passed around an article about that. We want to know, what do you all think about this? Have you used WeWork before? Would you miss WeWork if it were to go out of business? What would that tell us about the state of things right now? I'm joined by a couple of folks, but we're going to have folks coming in and out too. So we'll bring them on as they go. Right now in the house, Michael Liebowitz. Michael, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you for asking.
You are welcome. And also Morgan Carter is with us, the organizer, the behind the scenes guy who makes so much of this happen. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing on this fine Wednesday?
I'm not too bad, Robert. Happy to be on the show again.
Now, WeWork, and there's a chance that the man behind the scenes, Razi Ginsburg, will join us because he has firsthand experience with WeWork. Have either of y'all, Michael, Morgan, worked in a WeWork environment before or a shared office space?
I never even heard of WeWork until I got the topic.
So WeWork has a special place in my heart for a particular reason, which was that a little over a year ago, I was invited to come to a WeWork with our very own Razi, and I didn't realize that it was my unofficial kind of job interview for my current position. And that is the only time I've been to a WeWork. But I really love the whole kind of concept of WeWork. There's one in the UK called Spaces as well. I don't know if that exists in the US. Whenever I go into those, they're very cool. I like using them.
Excellent. Now, Keith Weiner has joined us. Thank you for joining the conversation. And Keith, welcome. How are you doing today?
Doing good. I'm in London at the moment.
All right. Now, we're discussing what's going on at WeWork, which is on the verge of bankruptcy. They were worth $47 billion. Now, today, they're estimated to be worth 1/100th of that. Now, that rise to $47 billion was arguably quick and inflated, but 1/100th of their previous evaluation. Keith, have you ever worked in a WeWork environment?
I've seen them, and I think Morgan was mentioning Spaces. That's what we rent in Scottsdale. We've also been another competitor, which is called Industrious. And, it should be a boring business. It's basically a real estate model that they somehow made very sexy, turned it into a story stock. And then in the Fed's falling interest rate environment, valuations get excessive. And, too much capital is bestowed upon companies that aren't worthy of it. And, classic. I mean, you see that over and over and over again. On top of that, you got operators that are, shall we say, creative with the truth, creative with how all the finances benefit themselves personally at the expense of the investors. What's his name? Adam Newman, I think, walked away with some enormous package relatively recently because he'd put in some sort of poison pills or whatever. You can't get rid of them. And then the investors are stuck holding the bag. And then the question is whether the whole thing's even viable in a downturn with rising interest rates and, falling employment, falling come to the office employment. Is the whole thing even viable? Who knows? And on top of that, they had kind of a duration mismatch problem where they took out these really long leases on their space, the larger spaces they took, and they have really short-term leases to their customers. So when everything's, hot and rising, they benefit. And when when things turn the other way, they get caught on the wrong end of it.
Well, I appreciate that. As the founder and CEO of Monetary Metals, I know you know about finance. Another person who knows a lot about finance is in our super chat, Jonathan Honig. Thank you for that, with a contribution to the ARCUK. Folks, as you're watching, if the mood hits you, please make your chat stand out. Put in a super chat, hit the $sign. Anything that you put in supports the ARCUK. And of course, if you're not already a member, there's a link right at the top. Become a member of the Ayn Rand Center UK. Help us make these shows, these conversations happen. Morgan, did you have any other thoughts on the WeWork situation?
Nothing profound, just that I don't know if this is what you guys, if you're aware of this, but WeWorks kind of were in a kind of scandal a few years ago. So it's a company that's been troubled for a little while. And I think it's a shame that they've continued to have these problems. And I would be really disappointed if WeWorks went away. I know you said you never heard of them, Michael, but if you ever get the chance, they're still around. WeWorks are I think they're very cool. If you ever go, like the WeWorks we've got in Edinburgh, they've got this beautiful property that's really nicely set up to go and use. I think it would just be a real shame if they left the market.
Well, the problem is, I think they've been in business for 11 years, and they're still not profitable, and they're going the other way. I mean, it's like, when I would watch a TV show, sometimes I'd get invested in the characters, and nobody else liked it, so they take it off the air. It sucks for me, but what are you going to do? And I don't know how they can keep running a business that way.
Yeah, it kind of brings to mind the Clubhouse platform, the audio platform, got real big around COVID. Everybody's staying at home, or at least not in the office, and so it rises up. WeWork kind of feels the same way to me. And now that post-COVID, people who have to work in an office are going back to the office, but WeWork spaces seem like something. You can't have clients necessarily in your house, but most of what you would use a WeWork for, it seems like you could do it in the home office. So I hope that they survive. I always hate to see a large company go out of business. I don't know that financially it can get much worse than the devaluation they've already had, but I hate to see them shutter. That would be a bad thing.
Add something to that. So we ran from a WeWork competitor. Spaces is owned by Regis, and they're the granddaddy in the space, been around for many decades. The product makes sense because it gives you flexibility. You say, okay, right now I'm 2 people, but I anticipate I might be 20 people or 5 people, but I don't really know in a year or 2. It gives you the ability to expand and contract and do all kinds of things that in a conventional office you can't. You get a lot of the services that, eventually you hire receptionists and other staff to do these things, but at that scale, it doesn't make sense. Or for remote outposts, I think there's a niche there. The problem is, at what valuation was the company sold? And did it get itself upside down? So a lot of these WeWork centers lose money, but because they thought they had unlimited ability to raise capital, it didn't matter, they were losing money. And so, yeah, you take this really nice property that would have a really high rent, and you agree to pay that, and you think, okay, who cares that we're not getting that much rent out of our customers now? Eventually, there'll be so much demand for a WeWork that our customers will pay more. Maybe that's the logic. And the problem is other companies with similar business models did the same thing, and there just was too much capacity relative to that, and you could never get the rent prices to rationalize for the thing. And so, of course, they accumulated debt. They did a bunch of other things, and then the company itself may go away. It wouldn't surprise me if, the thing survives out of bankruptcy, that somebody buys the assets, restructures it, and then what they're going to have to do is cram down the developers who own the big buildings and get the rent down and say, look, we're here, we're full, we can pay rent, but not that much, kind of beat them up a bit. And otherwise we're going to be vacant, and now you have more vacancy in a commercial real estate right now. That's a huge problem anyway. So beat them up, get the price down, and then get the rent to the point where A, they can fill their place because the rent is low enough to attract enough small businesses and remote outcrops of big businesses to fill it, and B, to do so at a price where they can actually have net positive cash flow, revenues from all their tenants minus the rent expense they have to pay to their landlord and other expenses equals a positive number. And hopefully they manage to, hopefully somebody buys it out of bankruptcy or whatever happens and they get to that point.
It's a great point. We hear about disaster stories like this, if it turns out to be a disaster. But you're right, the next step isn't just everything falls apart and it all goes to rot. Somebody could buy the properties and, as you say, renegotiate those contracts in a way where this business does become viable. We can hope that if WeWork falls through, that happens, and hopefully without necessarily closures and throwing people out before they reorganize, especially
Right.
for the sake of those we know who are working in WeWork environments.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other thoughts on WeWork, gentlemen?
Well, I was just going to ask Keith, just since it seems like you might know. Along with Spaces, we also have Regis here in Edinburgh. What do you think it is that Regis, since you said they're the kind of granddaddy in this, what do you think they're doing to be able to stay around for so long? Whereas WeWork, if you look at their company history, it's just problem after problem after problem after problem.
Regis has problems, or WeWork?
No, WeWork is. But so what do you think that Regis or Spaces are doing that's successful, whereas WeWork isn't?
I mean, so, our own experience as a tenant of these things, I think I would rate it in terms of the perks that they offer the tenants. WeWork is the greatest by far. Industrious is somewhere in the middle, and Spaces is definitely a lot less sexy. I think Regis just was like a regular old business that said, okay, we have to make money, so we have to be very careful in the properties we select and the rents we pay. We have to be careful in setting the rents we charge. They charge you, they nickel and dime you for a lot of things that WeWork would give you for free. But I'm sure those nickels and dimes add up, just like the airlines charging you for baggage, charging you for a snack, charging you for a beer. That revenue adds to the bottom line, and that might be all the profit they make flying that, that plane. They didn't see themselves as an exciting story. They saw themselves as a boring old business. Sometimes boring old businesses are the better ones because you don't have all the hoopla and all the dancing girls and the confetti and the brass band and all the rest of that. You just have business 101. So they tended to business 101. Okay, you want that conference room? Would you like that for 4 hours, sir? Well, we'll charge you $600 for it. And WeWork is like, everything's free, everything's wonderful, and they treat it almost more like a college frat party or something. And which is very popular with the tenants, I'm sure. At Industrious, they used to give us free snacks and free soft drinks and all kinds of stuff. Of course, everybody, when it's free, kind of uses it and abuses it. And I think that's how I would attribute the difference. They just had a for-profit mentality, and they were managed by business people.
I'll definitely say that Regis used to charge me £1 per coffee, whereas WeWork, its coffee is free. So I think you're probably right.
Yep.
Well, it is a formula to take a business like that and make it a success. And we'll hope that WeWork is going to be able to pull this off. And if not, we hope they reorganize quickly. I want to give a shout out to Free Trade. User Free Trade on YouTube has given us a super sticker there. Thank you very much. In Swedish krona. Man, 21st century, we can receive all these different currencies and it all gets converted automatically. You young people don't appreciate how amazing that is, but I'm loving it. Thank you, Free Trade, for your contribution. I mentioned you could put in a super chat, make your comments stand out, but if you want to do like Free Trade and just put in a super sticker to thank us to support the ARCUK, please feel free to do that. Now, gentlemen, sorry, I'm assuming genders again. I keep forgetting it is the 21st century, but guys.
Gender me, bro.
Second question for today, the TUC. Now, folks outside the UK won't know, but the Trades Union Congress, basically the union of unions, the people who brings them all together and bargains with a strong fist there. The TUC has called for a quote unquote modest wealth tax on the wealthy to bolster public services. This was interesting to me because in the United States, we don't have wealth taxes. We tax the hell out of everybody, give till it hurts. But the one thing we don't do is take what you've already got And unless it's invested, if it's taxed as capital gains, you don't pay taxes on it. So I thought the TUC's got this crazy idea, wealth tax. Well, those of you in Europe might know Spain has already done this with their solidarity tax. And it turns out Norway and Switzerland have as well. So now in the UK, the TUC has called for a modest wealth tax on the wealthy to bolster public services. So what do we think of this? And what do we think about organizations like the TUC in general? And Morgan, you're in the UK. Maybe you want to go first with that one.
Yeah, the Trade Unions Congress is this organization that rears its head every few years and makes everyone's life a little more unpleasant, rather like the union rep at a workplace tends to do. What stuck out to me, and actually it's funny you mentioned Norway. I've just had a friend move to Norway and he tends to be in favor of kind of higher taxes and redistributing wealth. And the first thing he mentioned to me was how eye-watering his tax bill had become since moving to Norway, which I always thought was quite funny. But about this wealth tax, the first thing that stuck out to me was the way they're speaking about it. It's as if nobody has mentioned this before, but since COVID, there's been a huge number of people who've been calling for these kinds of taxes on the wealthy, on energy companies, and all this kind of thing. And something that we're experiencing again in the UK, which we've had in previous decades, is brain drain of young people looking to move abroad to places where taxes are lower, where they can get a more competitive wage. And wealth taxes like this, it seems to me they were not in any way considering that this is going to exacerbate that problem. And I think there's a lot of angles from which you could criticize this kind of thing, but just the cluelessness that seemed to be present in their statements about exacerbating this problem of brain drain was what stuck out to me the most. I don't know if you guys have thoughts on that.
Brain drain has been an issue for less free countries forever, and why they would want to do anything that would exacerbate that, well, people who have that mindset, it seems like they have never cared about that, and we can only hope that people with better ideas are more in control. Keith, I'm curious, because you run an organization, a company you've started that does take in gold and silver and even pays interest on it. Would this affect your business if this wealth tax is produced?
Well,
started in the UK.
I was going to say, we're not a UK-based company, so it wouldn't hit us directly. To the extent that we have clients in the UK, it would be sapping their capital bit by bit. You know, I think Ayn Rand said the definitive things that needed to be said about coercive government and socialism and how immoral and impractical it is. As an economist, I can add that all taxes are harmful to the economy and to the actors in the economy in various ways. But if you had to stack rank them and say, what's the most harmful? The most harmful would be a tax on wealth or assets. I keep saying on social media, for example, that socialism is a combination of magical thinking plus envy. And here you have only a slight, tip of the hat or nod of the head to the magical thinking side, which is, oh yeah, if we tax the wealthy, then we're going to have better trains and underground, what they call the subway system here, and we're going to have better health, and we're going to have better all these things. And the math is off by 3 or 4 or 5 orders of magnitude, right? I mean, the magnitude of the problem versus how much you'd really get by doing this. So that's the magical thinking side. It's like, oh yeah, if we tax Bill Gates, then everybody can have free ponies and unicorns and rainbows and all these things. The envy side is really 90% of this. The goal is to render the rich not rich. They want to sap and drag down. It's like a crab bucket. If there's a crab that's climbing out of the bucket, the other crabs want to, pull it back. And that's pretty clearly naked. And you see the same thing with Bernie, AOC, Elizabeth Warren, whenever they angrily, and it's always with anger, they're angry at the rich. They say that the fact that one billionaire exists proves that there's a policy failure. That policy shouldn't allow anybody to ever attain $1 billion. I always want to say to them, well, which half of the billionaire equation do you want to stop? Do you want to stop them from being so productive? Or do you want to somehow let them be so productive and just strip mine them of the rewards of having been so productive? And then, of course, you obviously don't care that would be a pretty strong disincentive for anybody to bother producing anymore after a certain point. But you see the same thing in the US when they call for it. It's just the US electorate isn't quite as envy-ridden as the European electorate. And so these types of proposals fly in Europe and obviously pass, even in Switzerland of all places, which in some ways is much freer than the US, that don't have a minimum wage in Switzerland, for example. And your income tax rate, especially if you're an expat who's looking to move there, you can talk to all the various cantons and kind of negotiate a deal. And so to attract wealthy people, they're the opposite of the brain drain. They cut deals, and certain cantons are famous or infamous for that. I don't know how they deal with the wealth situation. I imagine the people that move to Switzerland for this purpose don't onshore their wealth. So if the wealth isn't onshore, then it wouldn't be I imagine wouldn't be subject to Swiss tax for an expat, if not a Swiss citizen at least. Anyway, enormously destructive, naked envy, and socialism always seeks to consume capital. They always think if they take what you've invested in and built over many decades or centuries, and then turn that into consumption, that boosts GDP and it helps people and all that. And they never ask, what do you do for an encore? Okay, you've eaten all the seed corn. What are you going to do next winter? What are you going to eat then? And they don't think, there's a scene in Atlas Shrugged when Jim Taggart sells off, was it the John Galt line? The only one that was profitable? Sells it off, and Dagny is furious at him. And he's like, well, you keep talking about making a profit. I made a profit. Why are you so angry? And of course, it's not a profit to liquidate a productive asset and then turn it into one-time revenue that you spend and then it's gone forever. But that's the mentality of this.
Right. Michael, any thoughts on this? The modest.
I actually do.
tax.
Yes. In Norway, they actually are having a problem where wealthy people are fleeing the country, the brain drain that you guys talked about. And I believe they're actually taking in less revenue after the wealth tax than they took in before. Also, I did an interview yesterday with Harry Binswanger about Italy. Italy or I don't know about but they have passed a 40% profit tax on banks. And in my discussion with Harry about this, with Dr. Binswanger, he believes that it's the hatred for life that causes people to go after the wealthy in this way. They go after profit because life ultimately requires profit. Profit is how we grow. It's how we expand, by making more than we had to begin with. And there's no real other reason that people would hate it that much and hate the wealthy. I mean, it's like Keith said, with the envy and the magical thinking. There's a woman on my Twitter feed. I think she's running for office. And every day there's stuff that comes across from her that healthcare should be free. Education should be free. I mean, it's just, well, it's not going to be free. And I actually asked her, okay, so it should be free, but who's going to pay for it? Because somebody has to pay for it, even if it's just with their labor, if you're going to compel people to work. But I just think it boils down to, it's the hatred of the good for being good. And it's unfortunate and it's reprehensible, and it always has negative effects.
Which is why Norway, when they discover that revenues went down, will not repeal this, because it wasn't really about revenues. At the end of the day, it was about, let's make the rich people less rich or not rich. And
Right.
at that goal, it's succeeding. I mean, it may not be raising any revenues, or it's actually harming revenues. They don't care. They care that they're hurting the rich, which is
Keith, you mentioned that in some ways the U.S. doesn't have that, but in some ways we're worse. It reminds me of Barack Obama saying, "You didn't build that." And he was misquoted. He didn't say you didn't build your business. He was making the point, well, all that infrastructure is out there that makes it possible for you to build your business. But Barack Obama and all the rest of the collectivists out there, they did build that. Who the hell do you think paid the taxes that put those roads and those rails and all that infrastructure out there? So even if you want to take him at his best interpreted meaning, yes. And the idea that you're then going to find another way to penalize people, another way to convince them to move somewhere else. Keith, you mentioned gaming the system. The problem is that the system is a game that can be gamed. It shouldn't be that way. The government shouldn't have that power.
I was going to say, just to add on the Barack Obama thing, 350 million Americans, only one of them did what Jeff Bezos did. Only one of them did what Bill Gates did, or any other entrepreneur you could name. And of course, the government mounts obstacles. When you're small and struggling, they make it harder and they bear down on you harder and harder. Then when you finally break through and get successful, then they want to say, well, you owe society. And of course, it was inevitable. The idea that you had just arose spontaneously because the market had evolved to that point. You didn't build that. You went to public school and there were roads. Yeah, but all the other people drive on those roads, and all the other people went to public school didn't. They would rather spend their money drinking beer and going to the football game, and they'd rather spend their free time on those things. And only the entrepreneur sweats the nights and the weekends, takes the enormous personal risk and so on, and has the idea, of course, in the first place. So yeah, it's all about how do you justify hurting the rich? How do you take away, morally strip him from any sense of legitimacy? And once you've done that, then materially stripping his wealth.
Just so naked jealousy, envy is the right word. They will let, you say, well, if you tax them more, you lose the trickle down, you lose the effect. People leave town, you have less money coming in. They will accept that rather than allow the inequality. There is that degree of not just desire to flatten us out, but to actually make sure there are no people that are going to make them feel bad about their situation, no one to compare to, no greatness. And speaking of greatness, let me jump to question number 3. We may end up tying this together in a few different ways, but it's T.E. Lawrence's birthday. This is the anniversary of the birth of Lawrence of Arabia. Not quite our hero of the week, but could be. First of all, do we all know something about T.E. Lawrence? And what do we think? Because there are arguments, there are reasonable arguments that he is a hero. There are arguments that he was a villain. What do we have? What are we thinking on T.E. Lawrence's birthday?
Oh, I would love to hear the argument for how he's a hero, because I just don't see it. I think he was brave. I think he was an effective leader.
Mm-hmm.
But being a hero to me implies a good cause, that you're fighting toward a good end. And it seems like all they were really fighting about was colonialism, who was going to control what parcel of land. And beside that, I mean, he knew that behind the scenes, that what the Arabs that he was leading into battle or going into battle with, what they were promised, they weren't going to be given. And he still was with them anyway. Now, he did fight for them afterwards to get the promises made kept, but he knew from I don't know about from the outset, but certainly ahead of time, he knew there was a good chance that the promise of an Arab kingdom, an independent Arab kingdom, was likely not going to happen. So my idea of a hero is somebody that has courage and fights for what's right. And I just don't see how, by any standard, he's fighting for what's right.
Let me read from a magazine article about it. Several historians view Lawrence's actions as crucial to the Allies' victory against the Ottomans in World War I. You've got to realize the Ottomans were allied with the Axis. They were our enemies. Furthermore, the Arab revolt ultimately did give rise to Arab nationalism, which for decades has been the foundation of many post-colonial countries in the Middle East. So as we talked recently about World War II and the dropping of the atomic bomb, and hundreds of thousands of people died in the worst possible way. And yet, in the full context, I believe we've argued, Nikos had a whole show arguing, that was the right thing to do in that context, rather than let that many more people die, especially on the Allies' side. Similarly, the Ottoman Empire still existed during World War I. It was only dissolved 4 years after the end of the war. And the Ottoman Empire was fighting for the Axis power, not the Allies. Would they have been defeated without the actions of T.E. Lawrence? So there's kind of your argument for him as a hero there.
Well, is it unequivocal that the Allies were the good guys in this situation? I mean, I understand World War II was a clash of civilization. We're fighting against communism. We're fighting against fascism. You had a guy on one hand in Stalin was our ally, so that doesn't even work. We weren't fighting communism. I'm sorry. We were fighting fascism in World War II. But in World War I, this was a typical European spat basically between these different countries that have always been fighting over land. It's hard for me to see how the Allied powers were heroes at all in this story. And in fact, it could be argued that without World War I, we don't end up with the necessity of going to World War II anyway.
A bold analysis. I have to think on that one. Morgan, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm just going to hold up my first edition of the 7 Pillars of Wisdom by T. Lawrence and of his lessons. So I'm a fan, but I was kind of raised to be a fan. So, and I also view him as a bit of a mixed figure. So I do have areas in which I agree with Michael, but there's a kind of myth of T. Lawrence, or Lawrence of Arabia. You know, he's got this kind of grand historic title, which kind of speaks of that. And have any of you seen the film, the famous kind of 60s film, Lawrence of Arabia?
I've seen it years ago.
The film does gives a good shot of kind of talking about the myth of Lawrence, because Lawrence was this guy who was kind of recognized as being remarkable by his colleagues. And for what I do regard him as a hero, or as a hero of mine, it's more for his personality, not for what he kind of achieved in the war. Because I would agree with you, Michael, that the kind of military objectives are more dubious. And then in the second half of the film, this American journalist follows him around. I want to say he's called William Archer, but his name is slipping my mind. And William Archer starts reporting from the Middle East about Lawrence and sending these reports back to America and some of them back to the UK. And he kind of deliberately cultivates this kind of image of Lawrence the hero, because Lawrence was leading a kind of guerrilla warfare campaign in the desert against this kind of overbearing empire. And you can very easily see how that kind of figure can become the stuff of legend, kind of darting out of nowhere, blowing up trains, assaulting cities like Aqaba against overwhelming kind of odds. So there's the stuff of heroes that you can make out of that, even if the actual kind of reality isn't necessarily there. The reason why I like Lawrence, so I grew up very near to where Lawrence of Arabia lived in the southwest of England. And you can go to his house where he lived, and it will show you his kind of life. And he'd lived a kind of life as almost like a warrior monk in this kind of weird way. He was this tiny guy. He kind of comes up to my shoulder. He studied archaeology at university and was kind of archetypically, I think, what you'd call a nerd. He loved reading about castles and all this kind of stuff. But he loved stories of knights and kind of medieval romances and things like that, and very consciously in his own mind decided he was going to be a hero, even though he's this tiny little guy who's not going to beat anyone up. And so in his rooms in Cambridge, where he went to university, he would kind of play with pistols, because he decided, you know, it's important for a modern hero to know how to shoot a gun and all this kind of stuff. And for his undergraduate dissertation, he went out to the Middle East and studied Crusader castles and wrote this dissertation, which is still studied as a very kind of worthy piece of scholarship in this area. And then he did this amazing kind of walk of thousands of miles across the deserts, kind of learning languages and history, staying with peoples. And which is why then when he joins the military in the First World War, he becomes very useful to the military, because he's very familiar with the area. Like a lot of British, successful British kind of heroes, he can speak the language, he can navigate the people and so on. And so the stories which Lawrence kind of loved were Arthurian romances of knights on horses with swords. And what's kind of funny is, because during the First World War, swords were still used to some extent, is he kind of goes away from European civilization to the one place in the world where he could charge into battle on a sword. And that's who he ends up becoming. He becomes this military leader, leading a guerrilla band against the Ottoman Empire, where he would charge into battle on a camel, not on a horse, but with a sword, and becomes this very charismatic kind of figure. And to me, when I was growing up, I kind of revered him as a hero of a guy with a kind of man of the intellect who also became a man of action, who kind of combined those two things together. And I think in there's a lot of the myth making too. If you read his letters, as he gets older, if you read his letters, he's in touch with a lot of the famous figures of his time, people like Churchill and Shaw, G.B. Shaw, lots of famous writers. And you can see Then once he leaves the military, he's kind of hounded by this myth because he's extremely famous back home. And he doesn't like it, and he kind of retreats into this aesthetic lifestyle. And he kind of realizes that it's false as well. And he kind of has to kind of find the own meaning in his life once again, once he's back home. And he kind of tries to do that. And he kind of, there are stories about the end of his life. So I don't know if I've come to a conclusion there, but there are some things which I regard him as a kind of a positive inspirational figure for. And then there are the more negative things, which are like some of the military objectives they were fighting for, some of the consequences of that, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which, to be fair, he was combating, which he didn't want to see take place. But as a result of some of his victories, the Sykes-Picot Agreement came into effect, which is a legacy of which is some of the troubles in the Middle East today. Him kind of dividing up the Middle East with Churchill on the back of a napkin whilst Churchill smokes a cigar. Some of these things aren't tremendously admirable, and are some of the reasons why people consider him a villain. But I guess because I've been raised with him as a villain, part of me still clings to kind of T. Lawrence the hero.
Interesting reminder that context is everything. Keith, any thoughts on T.E. Lawrence?
I don't really know anything about T.E. Lawrence, so I'm going to stay to my swim lane, but I can add something about causes of World War II. The treaty at Versailles was vindictive against the Germans, to say the least. And on top of that treaty, they did other things in the monetary system to try to prohibit. They were even in those days, the idea of German engineering, German factory productivity was intimidating, and the mercantilist, protectionist, nationalist types, got some additional measures imposed, post the Versailles Treaty that potentially could have forced Germany into starvation and poverty. Germany didn't produce in those days, I don't know if it does today, enough food for its people, but they depended on trade. They had lots and lots of high quality manufactured things to trade, and this interference with trade potentially threatened that. And so conditions in Germany, the United States, famously, we entered a depression around 1929. Germany had a depression from the end of the war on, and it was a much more severe one. And in that kind of environment, I certainly wouldn't try to say depression causes bad ideas and causes people to fall in love with charismatic, demagogue dictators. But it is certainly the case that charismatic demagogue dictators rise to popularity and they have fertile ground to exploit in that kind of economic environment. And had the Allies not done what they did at Versailles and post, maybe they wouldn't have been in World War II. Or maybe it would have been Japan against the world, and Germany might have been a more reasonable country. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, my impression of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, was that he was enormously competent, passionate, thoughtful, but he wasn't necessarily right in his goals, aspirations, understanding of the moral situation he was in. In that sense, I think he was absolutely a hero, and yet there are reasons why some people do regard him as a villain. I think those are both true. It's interesting that this happens, in the early 1900s, in the 20th century. If we go back far enough in history, we can look at, for example, military conquerors. You can argue that, Alexander the Great is a villain. But the further we get away from it, we can still admire their ability and their determination and their passion and their single-mindedness and their creativity and the things that make them great warriors. And in that sense, I completely understand why so many people regard Lawrence of Arabia as a hero, right down to that he was willing at times to do what he thought was right, regardless of what the British High Command thought was right. In the end, he didn't do that when he most should have. But again, that's just my understanding. I can look at a character like that and say there are ways in which I would like to be more like that. So I will say happy birthday.
There's something else I can just add on there. Since you mentioned Alexander the Great. Another reason why I liked Lawrence when I was growing up, there's a great quote about him, who I can't remember who said it, but it was that Lawrence experienced the competition from dead men. And what is kind of meant by that is that Lawrence was kind of comparing himself to great heroes from history, one of which was Alexander the Great. So supposedly Lawrence would read kind of famous works and would flick to the front and look at how old the great writer had been when they published this work. And if he was older than them and hadn't published a great book by that point, he felt very anxious. So he kind of wanted to be a great man. And in doing that, he kind of imitated some of these great heroes like Alexander the Great. So Alexander famously carried the Iliad around in a golden box wherever he went on campaign. And when Lawrence was on campaign, he used to carry Thomas Mallory's Mort d'Arthur, or Death of Arthur, which is a famous Arthurian story, and the Iliad, like Alexander, underneath his pillow, and would read them whilst he was on campaign, which doesn't necessarily make you a hero, but those are kind of charming details about him that I quite like.
Sounds slightly second-handed.
Yeah, there is probably a little bit of that, but I like these kind of exotic figures who swagger out into these kind of dangerous places. And if you ever look at the pictures of Lawrence, he's kind of wearing the Arabian garb of like a prince that he's been given, and he's kind of swaggering into battle. And I like all that stuff, even if it's just aesthetic more than real. That kind of thing appeals to me.
It reminds me of the conversations we've had about crime and criminals and why do people idolize crime. It's interesting that we can look at characters, again, who, even if they're not actually criminals, who are not heroes, and yet have the determination, the presence of mind, the wisdom, the swagger, and say, wow, as long as we can keep those things in context, without letting ourselves actually admire their morality as well as their accomplishments or their style or their determination. And I think there's value in doing both of those, because we do have heroes throughout history we can look at and say, I admire 98% of what he did. Why would I look at somebody who's more mixed? But very few people who we would say I admire 100% of what he did. So I think that ability to know what we admire about a person without letting ourselves be simplistic and say, and I completely evade the wrong things that he did. That's powerful stuff.
Most people are mixed. They had some good ideas, some bad ideas. And the theme here is there's some people that are just incredibly effective at accomplishing something versus, we were saying earlier, everybody drives on public roads. Most people went to public schools. There's only one Jeff Bezos that created an Amazon. So very effective. Now, Jeff Bezos' political views kind of lean left, right? So that's anathema. And there's a lot of objectivists who want him to fail and think everything he's done has been total shit because, because his political views skew left. But if you look at it and say, okay, he's a very effective businessman who's very rational in how he ran the business. He's retired now, but at the same time had this other side that he bought the Washington Post and obviously supports their lefty crusade or whatever you want to call it. He's mixed, and that's the real world, right? People are mixed, most people.
Just so, don't let that ruin your admiration for heroism. I'm a big admirer of Henry Ford. Well, Henry Ford was 98% good. And you can look at his attitudes on finance, his accusations against the Jewish bankers, the actual newspapers and newsletters he let be circulated in the name of his company that doesn't matter. That's the smallest part of who he was and what he did. And even with more mixed characters, say Elon Musk, you can admire SpaceX, you can admire what he's done. At the same time, as you say, well, would Tesla even exist without the subsidies and the regulations that harmed other legitimate businesses that he fought for?
I would argue the problem with Musk is that the bad part is in precisely the area that he is renowned to be a hero, which is in his business. If you look at the claims and the advertising and the interviews he did, particularly, let's say, around Hyperloop, just outright scientific and engineering fraud on top of fraud on top of fraud on top of fraud. You know, there's videos out there looking at the claims made, very specific engineering claims made about Hyperloop, and just how it's just outright fraud. And the whole purpose of this fraud was to rake in public largesse. You know, versus Henry Ford, what he's famous for is both a car company and the assembly line and a whole new corporate structure. What he's not famous for, right, he was a rabid anti-Semite, but that's not what he achieved in his life. That's not what he really pursued. He was an incredible businessman who innovated and changed the world and gave us something amazing, who happened to have some odious views. Musk is a businessman who's mixing dishonest, crony, you know, thieving business, profiteering on the mixed economy business. He's a mixture of an Oren Boyle with and maybe a little bit of a Wesley Mooch and a Mr. Thompson, with a little bit of a Hank Reardon. But
I'm just curious, do you regard his SpaceX and the Boring Company, do you regard those as critically as you do Tesla?
I'm less familiar with it. So some of the things I've read is that every time he goes in public and says something, the engineers that have to actually make it work are rolling their eyes, and it's like, oh, there he goes again, because he's saying things that aren't true, that are impossible, or, you know, 5 years out, and he's saying we've already done it. So he mixes a P.T. Barnum huckster's promotionalism with, you know, and I have a lot of sympathy for entrepreneurs who attempt some version of what's called fake it till you make it, that who believe wrongfully, I would add, because I think this is a huge mistake, that if you tell everybody where you're really at, that everyone's going to lose interest and think that you're nothing and never going to amount to anything, and try to portray yourself as much bigger and much richer and much more successful than you really are. I get that. I have some degree of sympathy, at least where they're coming from emotionally, the frustrations of pitching until, you know, your tongue falls out and, you know, whatever. But his lying seems to be pathological. The things that he says, and there's also a malevolence to it. When he took over Twitter, he walks in on the first day carrying a sink, and the idea is let it sink in. I'm now your new boss, and has this perverse, sadistic pleasure of twisting the knife and telling everybody you're sacked, you're a loser, get out of here, and all these things, and did it in a vindictive and arbitrary and capricious way. Clearly there needed to be restructuring, clearly they needed to cut costs, but he did it in a way that seemed wanton and careless. And something I know as a business manager, if you are that kind of boss that people fear and also at the same time make a bit of a joke of yourself, you will lose all the good people, the ones you need to retain, and the ones you retain are the sycophants and the ones that are desperate for the job. And so you will weaken your company in ways that people say, well, it worked, right? I mean, he saved the money and whatever, but the way in which you weaken your company may not be felt for years, because it's all the things that are in development. It's the robustness of how you monitor and support your, you know, your software in the cloud and all of that. And if you lose a lot of those engineers, you don't have a crisis every day, but when you have a crisis, you may not be able to respond to it. So Twitter has had some very funny outages since he's, you know, taken control that, you know, might not have had. Yeah, I'm extremely critical of everything he's done, because I think a lot of it is a veneer of success and achievement. And clearly he has achieved and has succeeded at certain things. He's mixed, right? You can't say that he's a complete loser. He's not just a whining, mooching, lying, you know, fool. He clearly is a smart guy and has achieved some things. But combined with that is this, you know, propensity to commit securities fraud. I mean, there's no question in my mind that his claim that Tesla was going to be acquired and taken private, and he named a price per share, and then the board was actually forced to come out and say, yeah, you know, by the way, if what he said was true, we would have had to have been involved because there would be in advanced discussions. It's not true. And it's illegal to, and regardless of what you think of securities regulation, the law is what it is illegal to go out and say something that is true, untrue, it's material, and the purpose of which is to manipulate the stock price, which clearly that was.
Okay.
Anyways, you get the point.
Much more mixed hero than if you can even use the word hero. I guess when you think about Tesla or what he's done to Twitter, to X, you'd say, well, he's kind of Elizabeth Holmes who got lucky. Michael, Morgan, any more thoughts on the subject?
I do.
Yes.
I have something to say. As somebody who's not representing himself to be something he's not, I am actually very poor, and I need subscribers to my podcast, and I need people to buy my books. But can I say that for heroes, when I think of like Great Britain and I think of heroes coming out of Great Britain, I think of John Lilburn. I don't know how many people are familiar with John Lilburn, but to me, he was fighting for liberty, and he spent a lot of time in the Tower of London. He was tortured. He was very single-minded. I'm sure he was mixed like most people, but I think by and large, he was heroic. Morgan, are you familiar with Lilburn at all? Captain John Lilburn?
I'm not, and I feel really gutted because I'd like to say I've got a good command of British heroes, but I'm just looking him up now. Oh, he's a leveler. Okay, sure. I like the levelers, so I'll look him up. But
yeah, he was a fantastic guy.
Yeah, and there certainly are greater British heroes than T. Lawrence, and even greater kind of in Britain. We like to kind of revere our martial heroes, as I'm sure any country kind of does, which can get you into tricky water. But something else I was just going to say, since we mentioned Henry Ford, a few months ago I went to the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit. Which was a really interesting place because they've kind of recreated the workers' village from the time, from about 100 years ago. And if you ever get a chance, if you're in Detroit, to go to the Henry Ford Museum, it's a really incredible place. It's really like 3 or 4 museums kind of put together in one. And you get kind of a sense of what a tremendous achievement it was, of what he was able to put together there. And I feel much more mixed about Ford for the kind of anti-Semitism and some of the kind of violence that was employed by people he employed. But the Henry Ford Museum is an incredible place to go. So I'd encourage you all to go visit there if you're in Michigan.
Well, folks who know me know I will second that, not just because I am broadcasting live from Motown, but Mrs. Nacer, Amy Nacer, actually works for the Henry Ford.
Oh, there you go.
And before working in the offices 10 years ago, she spent a year as a presenter in Greenfield Village. So I could talk about that all day as well. But yes, this question of mixed heroes, I think this needs to be a future topic because it also touches on artists, movie actors, musicians, people with opinions we abhor. And in some cases, that even touches their work. And yet we admire their work. We enjoy what they produce. A great topic. Thank you for your thoughts on that. Again, I will give a shout out to the late T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, for those things I admire about him. And yes, a mixed case, certainly worth looking into. Lots of inspiration to be found there and lots of reasons to be critical as well. Now,
a great movie as well. If anyone wants to go watch a good movie, Lawrence of Arabia is a great film.
Yes. And I'm overdue. I'm sure I saw it when I was young. Don't remember. So it's going to be worth looking at. Folks, thank you for joining us for The Reality Show. And we will do this all over again tomorrow at 6 o'clock UK time, as well as the Daily Objective at 5:30. Translate that into your own time. I know here in Motown, right around the corner from the Henry Ford and Greenfield Village, that's 12:30 and 1 o'clock. Great lunchtime shows. Michael, Morgan, Keith, thank you for joining me. We will do this again. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. Before I sign out, don't forget to go to AynRandCenter.co.uk, sign up, become a member, support these shows, and that's your opportunity to participate in the Saturday forums, your opportunity to participate in these great new mock trials, the study sessions with James Valiant, the fiction club on Tuesdays. Currently, we're studying The Fountainhead, all sorts of good stuff. You're both having a great time. You're helping us save the world, spread the word, help people live their own best lives. Gentlemen, yes, I'm going to make that assumption again. Thank you for joining us. We'll do this all again tomorrow. Best of premises to everybody.